Aisha Angraini from Rakuten Viki. She is an engineer in the front-end team in Rakuten Viki, and she has a good experience with building functional and beautiful UIs. And she is gonna explain us and talk about the future of UIs today.
Hello. Konnichiwa. Hello, everyone. My name is Aisha Angraini. I'm a front-end engineer at Viki. So today I'll be speaking about layouts in the world of responsive web development. Now, for those of you who have worked on responsive web projects before, you know that responsive web development often forces you to change your design, development, and testing workflow. And as your workflow changes, so does your tools. Your tools evolve in order to fit with the changing nature of our workflow. So today, I'll be talking about one example of such tools, which is the new CSS Grid specification. But before I get into the details of CSS Grid specification, I would like to walk you through the tools that we had used in the past and are currently using in dealing with web layouts, so that you can appreciate the existence of CSS Grid even more, and you'll be more motivated to learn about it. So, for those of you who have worked on any types of UI engineering before, you will notice these kinds of tools that I've listed in the slides here. One of the most popular ways for you to create web layouts is with floats, as evidenced with the very popular CSS frameworks that we have, like Bootstrap, Materialize, and Foundation, something that you would recognize if you worked with responsive web before. So, prior to the existence of Flexbox, you have inline blocks if you want to arrange elements side by side, especially if you want to arrange links on the navigational elements or a group of thumbnails together. Prior to the existence of Flexbox as well, if you want to do something much more specific, such as creating equal height columns, you would use table-based layouts for that. Now, if you want to go way experimental, where you want to arrange your columns and grid in a much more specific manner, you would use absolute and relative positionings, and if all else fails, you will use JavaScript. So what's wrong with our current and past tools? Why the need for a new tool in order to create web layouts? Well, this is because the previous tools that we have and the current tools that we are currently using, they are not designed for you to work with page layouts at all. So for example, if you look at floats, floats are actually not designed for you to work with a grid system on your page. Float is actually used for if you want to align an element or, say, position an image on the left or right of your layout and wrap text around it. This is a common use case for floats. And of course, and all tools that we used to abuse before the rise of Flexbox, the table layout, it is not designed for you to create equal height columns. It is actually designed for something much more trivial than that, which is to display data on your web page. Now, what happens when you're using tools that are not designed to solve problems that you're trying to solve in the first place? Well, you're using these tools as a hack. And we're using it as a hack, there will be consequences in the future. Say, for example, on a float-based layout, you have your layout that is heavily reliant on the source order of your HTML source code. This is because on a float-based layout, you are not creating a grid system, you are imitating a grid system. And in order to achieve the spaces between your columns and rows, you will need row wrappers in order to pull and push those margins. And also you need to clear those floats. When you're working with Bootstrap, or if you've created your own grid system before, you will recognize this verbose HTML syntax over here, where you have rows and column wrappers that wrap around your content. Now, another thing, when you're creating layouts with inline blocks or floats, there are no straightforward manner to actually order your elements around. Okay, let me give you something of a common example. Let's say that you have two elements that are supposed to stack on top of each other on a smaller screen device. In this case, you know that the about element should appear right before the trailer element. And you know that at a glance, in your HTML, the about element syntax should actually appear right above the trailer syntax. But what if your designer wants something much more different for larger screen devices? What if your designer wants the trailer element to appear right before the about element in larger screen devices? So there's no straightforward way to actually order your elements around with float-based layouts or inline block. But of course, there's a hack for this as well. You can always use media queries in your CSS. When your layout reaches a specific breakpoint, you can always float the trailer elements to the left and the about element to the right. But what if you're dealing with something much more complex, such as a 3-column layout? You can't fix it that way. You need to introduce perhaps JavaScript to fix that, which actually leads to complicated CSS and markups, and also the unnecessary addition of a JavaScript library, which could potentially impact the performance of your web page. And it's also important to remember that when you're using floats or inline blocks in order to order your elements around, these elements have no relationship with one another. This is why it is very difficult for you to achieve equal height columns with floats as well. And when you're using floats, primarily for your layout, you have these large spaces between your columns and rows, which gives a very jarring experience for users when they're browsing your web page. It's also important to know that when there's no relationship at all, it is very hard to align elements as expected. So luckily for us, this is a good time to be a front-end engineer. We have Flexbox. Flexbox is a new layout mode. Well, it's not really new, but it's just a layout mode for making it easy for you to arrange elements in one dimension. It makes it easy for you to arrange elements in horizontal, vertical, or in reverse. So what is a prime candidate for Flexbox? You would use Flexbox if you want to achieve equal height columns. You would use Flexbox if you want to center elements vertically and horizontally at the same time. And finally, the problem that I described earlier, where there's no easy way to order elements around with floats and inline block, that is not the case with Flexbox. You can always order elements using the order property in your CSS and making it easier for you to achieve that, and your layout, it's not particularly tied heavily to your source code. But here's the thing about Flexbox, still not enough. Flexbox is not designed for you to create a full page layout. It only allows you to arrange items vertically or horizontally. It's not for page layout at all. You cannot actually manipulate the row and column very easily. This is where the new specification comes in, the CSS grid. So CSS grid is actually a new layout mode for working with elements arranged in 2 dimensions. With CSS grid, you can actually manipulate the rows and columns of your layout easily, giving you a true layout system. You're no longer imitating a grid system with CSS grid, you actually have a grid system. So why exactly would you want to use CSS grid over Flexbox, floats, or inline blocks? Well, one reason is very simple to use. And your layout is no longer so reliant on your HTML code, leading to a much more maintainable code. So let us compare the HTML syntax for a float-based layout to one for CSS grid layout. You will notice that, as I mentioned before, it's very much like the HTML code is very verbose for float-based layout. This is because you need those row wrappers in order to push and pull your margin and also to clear those floats. But with CSS grid, you have HTML code that is much more succinct. Why is that? Well, instead of actually relying on the source order of your HTML, you can control your layout in a very straightforward manner through CSS. So how would you use CSS grid? It is as simple as declaring the display property with the value of grid. In order to define how many columns you want and what is the width of your column, you would define grid template columns. In this case, I define it as 25% 4 times because I want 4 columns with a width of 25%. Instead of using margins in order to control the spacings between your rows and columns, you are actually using the grid gap property immediately, making it much more straightforward to control. Now, let's talk about how I could make this much more interesting. Let's say that I want the second column to be wider in size and longer vertically. I would use the grid column and grid rows in order to control my rows and columns. For example, the second column, I had assigned it to a position of the second column so that it will span 2 columns. And in order to make it longer, I position it on the first row and spanning it to 2 rows. I can also use grid column and grid row individually. For example, the 4th column. I use grid row, put it under the second row so that it spans also to 2 rows. And finally, the 7th column, I position it on the 3rd column and also making it span 2 columns, making it wider. But here's another cool thing about CSS Grid. It doesn't just give you a tool for you to actually control the rows and columns of your layout. It also makes it more intuitive and elegant for you to calculate the length of your layout and also the height. It comes with a new unit, the FR unit. FR stands for fractions. It treats your elements as fractional parts in your web layouts. So instead of using percentage-based layouts, I would just declare 1FR 4 times to achieve the same thing. So how does fractional units actually work? So if I declare 1FR 4 times, it'll give you 4 columns that are a quarter of the available space of your web layout. I can also declare 2FR and 1FR, giving you one element to be 2/3 of the available space of your layout, and another one, finally, 1/3 of the available space of your layout. So it's very intuitive and elegant to work with. You do not need to actually calculate your layouts manually. You can use FR for that. But its elegance and intuitive nature is not the only reason why you want to use fractional layouts. See, when you're using percentage-based width in order to calculate your layout, you need to understand that it doesn't really include the grid gap that you have specified. This will actually lead to a very weird horizontal scroll bar effect, which is not what you want for responsive web development. But with fractional units, it immediately takes into account the grid gap that you have specified, the spacings between your rows and columns. But for any reason, if you need to declare percentage-based units or pixel-based units for your layout, you need to understand that you can mix these units with fractional units. In this case, I have declared the first 2 elements as percentage-based units and the rest as fractional units. And again, fractional units will keep in mind your grid gap that you specified, and also these different percentage and pixel units that you have used for your layouts. Now, using grid rows and grid columns can actually be a bit overwhelming, especially if you want to control your layout in a much more specific manner. Understand that you can do this easily using grid template areas. If you notice that the colorful boxes, each of the element actually corresponds to the syntax that I had written on under grid template areas property. What does that mean? It means that you can actually draw your layout by using this syntax directly under grid template areas, which gives you more control on the positioning of your layout. So, of course, you do not want to do this for full page layout because it can be very rigid, but you would want to use this for much more specific components such as masthead of your header or perhaps thumbnail presentation components to your web page. Now, at this point you might think, should I use Flexbox or should I use CSS Grid? Should I choose one over the other? But you need to understand that CSS Grid is not designed in order to succeed Flexbox. It's not designed to replace Flexbox. In fact, it is actually designed for it to work well with Flexbox. You can actually use Flexbox and CSS Grid in order to create a much more flexible layout that is much more powerful. So how would you use it together? In this case, you can use CSS Grid in order to arrange the rows and columns of your layout. If you want to arrange the elements within those rows and columns, this is when you use CSS Grid. In this case, for the text on the hero column, I had put it down, and by actually using Flexbox align items flex and for that. Now, there are much more CSS Grid features that I've left out for this talk because I think a 25 minutes talk is not enough to talk about CSS Grid. But I really want you to check out CSS Grid. By learning about it, you can check out CSS Grid Garden. It's actually a really cool website because it's game-based that makes it easy for you to learn about CSS Grid. Once you familiarize yourself with the CSS Grid property, I suggest you to look at CSS Grid Playground created by the folks at Mozilla. So it makes it easy for you to understand terminologies that come with CSS Grid, such as grid lines and grid tracks, giving you a much more stronger foundation and knowledge for CSS Grid. Now, for real life example, it is also important for you to visit this site. I think it's one of the sites that's very important in learning about CSS Grid. Check out Grid by Example by Rachel Andrew. What I like about this site is it gives examples by using real life layout, and also it includes fallbacks for older browsers that do not support CSS Grid. So you understand how to structure your code in order to support older browsers and also newer browsers. And finally, if you're interested in cool things that you can use CSS Grid with, that you can create with CSS Grid, I created a bunch of CSS Grid experiments under my CodePen. You can check it under collections. These are very experimental. You wouldn't want to use it in production, but it's something that is interesting to see the power of CSS Grid. Now, I can't really talk about CSS Grid without touching on the browser support. Know that CSS Grid is widely supported by all modern browsers, but what if you need to support older browsers? That doesn't mean that you need to shy away from CSS Grid at all. You can always look at the support statements, or otherwise known as feature queries. Now, for those of you who have worked on the web for a very long time, you might have heard of Modernizer. Modernizer is actually a JavaScript library that performs feature detection to see if this particular browser supports a particular feature or not. So you can think of feature queries as modernizers in your CSS. So how would you actually use the support query? You can write your fallback code for older browsers, and after that you can use the support statement in order to check if your browser actually supports a particular feature, in this case, whether it supports Grid. And within that particular support statement, you can write CSS for that new browser, or even override the fallback code that you had written before. Now, with the support statement, you probably have questions about whether do you have to code the same layout twice? Well, yes, only if you expect the same layout experience in all kinds of browser. You do not need to have similar experience in all browsers. For example, you cannot expect a site to be the same on IE8 versus the one in Google Chrome 50. For example, you cannot expect the same experience. It's pretty unrealistic. What I would suggest for you to think about is, when you're creating layouts with CSS Grid, think about creating accessible layout first. Code in accessible HTML. Make sure that it's accessible so that it can be used by any kinds of users, right? And then after that, you need to code those layouts with a particular tool that is supported by all kinds of browsers. Doesn't mean that if it's old or new, it doesn't matter. For example, you can just create a layout that is like one column, for example. And then finally, you can progressively enhance your layout in modern browsers. This is where you want to put code with CSS Grid. Now, I didn't add this example here, but you can always check out this example that I've created. I created an experimental thumbnail presentation with CSS Grid that should work for all modern browsers, but you can also view it in older browsers, such as, say, for example, Safari 9 that doesn't support CSS Grid, and see the fallback. You will notice that even though it is experimental in modern browsers, but you can still access it and read it for older browsers. That doesn't mean that you forget about users in older browsers at all. And finally, if you want to learn more about feature queries, I'll suggest you check out this article by Jen Simmons. It's very good in order to get you up to speed about feature queries. I would definitely urge you to look into CSS Grid because it is definitely the new standard in creating new web layouts. You should definitely learn more about it, and as we say here at Rakuten, you need to always improve and always advance. And of course, thank you so much for your attention today. I'll be happy to talk about any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. It was a great presentation, lots of color, lots of visuals, so really easy to understand. So if you have any question, please feel free to ask.
So I just want to say, first of all, thank you. That was a great presentation. When it comes to grid gaps, does that affect the first and the last element? And if it does, is there a way to get rid of the gap on the side of first and last elements?
So the question is, for grid gap, does it affect the first and last spacings? The answer is no, it doesn't affect, only in betweens. Yeah. Any other questions?
So I'm guessing Vicky uses grid on their site, or not yet?
We're in the process.
Okay.
Yeah.
So were you the one who convinced your team to start using that, and how did you go about convincing them to, upgrade their code?
The question is whether I had to do any convincing to my team whether to adopt CSS Grid or not. Fortunately, I did not have to do much convincing. As we do things here at Rakuten Wiki, we follow the Rakuten principle, which is always improve and always advance, where my team is very susceptible to change. So when we have new tools, we would immediately experiment with a particular page layout at Wiki. In this case, we took a particular, not the home page, but something much more specific, like a profile page, for example, and then we apply CSS Grid there. It's in another branch. We haven't actually pushed it to production yet, but we will do that soon. But the answer is not really much convincing. And if you do need to convince, I think it's very important to show them videos about CSS Grid and also new specification, new information about CSS Grid. I think they'll be much more successful to that because CSS Grid in itself is the future of how you should be doing your layout.
Question over there.
Thanks for the talk. I would like to know what's the drawback of the CSS Grid, and what's the drawback?
Drawback. Okay.
Yeah, disadvantage, and what's the unsuccessful story you have been through, you've been experienced with the CSS Grid? Thanks.
All right, one of the drawback of CSS Grid is, any of you have visited Pinterest before? Pinterest, you know how the layout is very nice on Pinterest? Well, a lot of misconception with CSS Grid is that you think that if you use CSS Grid, such a layout will come for free. But that's not the case with CSS Grid. CSS Grid will not give you a masonry kind of layout. You still need to use masonry library for that. This is because when you're trying to be experimental with CSS Grid, you still need to manipulate your grid rows and grid columns and hard code those sizes on your own. But if you want something that is much more automated, you still need to use JavaScript for that. So for some sort of layout, CSS Grid, it's still I find it still pretty rigid in doing it because of the rows and columns and how you need to manipulate that on your own. So if you have something that is like Pinterest, where the information keeps on coming as you scroll, you wouldn't want to use CSS Grid for that. You would still want to use masonry library. CSS Grid is only for, say for example, your layout, you have like a particular specific numbers of columns and rows that you know would be, and it's not going to be added in. I think this is where CSS Grid excel the most.
Thank you, Aisha. So we don't have any more time, so if you have any question, please talk to Aisha later on. Thank you again for the presentation.